that deal. The White House is very hard to read. Do they want a deal or not?
Economy, it will certainly not be good for any economy to tariff each other and back and forth, reciprocal tariffs.
The headline said Trump won. Canada had backed down, scrapping a digital services tax just hours before it took effect. Trump reopened trade talks and claimed victory. But behind the scenes, the pressure was only building. Now Trump is going further, targeting one of Canada's most vital sectors, auto manufacturing. And as the deadline approaches, Prime Minister Mark Carney is signaling this fight isn't over. This is no longer just a tax negotiation. It's a clash over economic survival, with two nations locked in and one sector at the center. But the president keeps talking about sticking points like supply management. Obviously, he's going after auto sector, so we'll see. It's looming, only 19 days and counting. Since March 2025, the U.S. has imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian automobiles with small carve-outs for U.S.-made parts. The move hit hard across an integrated cross-border supply chain. Canada exports around 85% of its auto production to the U.S., most of it through systems where parts cross the border up to 6 or 7 times before final assembly. But tariffs broke that rhythm. U.S. automakers facing cost uncertainty paused many new tooling programs in Windsor, Ontario, Canada's auto hub. Some facilities laid off up to 50% of workers by mid-2025. Even logistics stalled. Truckers reported slower traffic and fewer loads. With over 70% of U.S.-Canada trade moved by truck, the disruption spread fast. Donald Trump seems so intent on destroying Canada's ability to make cars. That seems to be such a suus. April 2025 brought more bad news. According to Statistics Canada, Canadian auto exports to the U.S. dropped 23% compared to April 2024. The chain reaction was immediate. Halted production, idle workers, frozen investments. But amid the damage, Carney began recalibrating. In early July, the Prime Minister met with top executives from Ford Canada, GM Canada, Stellantis, and the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. Behind closed doors, they mapped out responses from legal options to production shifts. One sticking point was Canada's zero-emissions vehicle mandate. As of Q1, 2025, EVs made up only 8% of new vehicle sales. Yet, the law required that 20% of all passenger vehicles sold in 2026 be EV or hybrid. Automakers warned the target was unreachable. Missing it would mean buying carbon credits or paying up to 20,000 Canadians per vehicle for charging infrastructure. Facing economic headwinds and corporate backlash, Carney signaled flexibility, not surrender. He also leaned into longer-term reforms, dismantling interprovincial trade barriers and accelerating free trade efforts with Europe and Asia. It's a shift modeled after Australia, diversifying away from U.S. dependence. This wasn't retreat, it was repositioning. Trump's next deadline is July 9th. That's when his temporary tariff freeze ends. Unless Canada makes new concessions, more tariffs could be triggered, possibly targeting untaxed sectors. But Carney has his own date circled, July 21st. That's the deadline he set for a new Canada-US deal. If no agreement is reached, Ottawa could reintroduce its retaliatory tariffs, covering over $125 billion in U.S. goods from agriculture to tech. Meanwhile, the public is already pushing back. The Buy Canada movement is growing. Consumers are ditching U.S. wine and spirits. Cross-border travel is down. Vacation homes in Florida are hitting the resale market. Canadians aren't waiting for policy. They're voting with their wallets. Behind the scenes, Canada is also working to expand trade with the EU and Indo-Pacific, building economic resilience far from Washington's reach. The next 2 weeks will decide everything. Will Trump push for more, confident that Canada will blink again? Or has he overplayed his hand, pushing Carney into a corner where retaliation becomes politically unavoidable? On July 9th, we may see the first answer. By July 21st, we'll know who flinches and who fights back. This isn't just about cars, it's about leverage, leadership, and how far each side is willing to go. Stay tuned. Well, in the Northeast, if you're looking at New England and New York, tourism is down between 20 and 60%. Welcome back. With trade deadlines looming and no G7 summit deal, Canada now preparing to retaliate against the U.S. with new tariffs. This summer, something unusual is happening across the U.S. Northeast. Airports are emptier, hotels are quieter, retail stores in Boston and New York are reporting soft foot traffic. The reason Canadian tourists, once a reliable economic boost, are no longer coming. The numbers tell the story. According to Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey, Canadian tourism across New England is down between 20% and 60% compared to previous spring travel seasons. It's not a coincidence. It's the ripple effect of Donald Trump's tariffs on Canada and Ottawa's quiet but calculated response. We're just not seeing the Canadian tourists in this region. We've had school trips canceled that, normally happen in the spring in particular. The damage isn't confined to airports. School trips from Canadian provinces have been canceled. Regional carriers serving Logan Airport report declines in cross-border traffic. Restaurants and local stores in tourist-heavy districts across New York and Vermont are seeing lower revenue. The tourism sector has become one of the first clear victims of a trade policy few expected to hit consumers so directly, the Northeast region. And they're also seeing in Florida as well, by the way, numbers are way down in terms of Canadian tourists. And it's not just the Northeast Florida, a longtime magnet for Canadian visitors during the winter and spring, is also seeing steep declines. These missing travelers are pulling millions in lost revenue out of the U.S. economy, not with protests or tariffs, but simply by staying home. U.S. wine exports to Canada plunged in April. They were down more than 90%. While tourists are disappearing, so is the wine. In April 2025, U.S. wine exports to Canada dropped by a staggering 93% year-over-year based on trade data reported by CBC News and the American Association of Wine Economists. That's not a typo, 93%. Before the tariffs, Canada accounted for over one-third of U.S. wine exports by value, largely higher-end wines averaging $7.50 per bottle, significantly above the global average export price of $5. With those exports now nearly halted, U.S. producers are facing a glut in supply. Wineries in California, where 93% of U.S. wine is produced, are now left with surplus stock and falling prices. Bulk buyers like the U.K. still exist, but at much lower prices. Premium markets like Canada and China are closing. Overall, U.S. wine exports fell 43% in April 2025 compared to April 2024. The fallout isn't theoretical. It's hitting balance sheets across agriculture, logistics, and distribution. It's a recognition that these are allies, long-standing relationships that just shouldn't be ripped up, shredded overnight. Beyond travel and wine, broader economic pressures are emerging on both sides of the border. In the U.S., tariffs on Canadian aluminum and steel are already being passed down to consumers. A 2025 report from the Healey administration estimates that New England households could see a combined $2.5 billion increase in heating bills over the next several years, driven by higher costs of imported materials. Meanwhile, small businesses in retail, food service, and even health sectors are seeing higher input costs. Many are now reconsidering Canada-based suppliers or trimming operations. In Canada, the pressure is more indirect but real. Supply chains connected to U.S. markets are strained. Exporters are adjusting to bypass American ports, and consumers are seeing delays in substitution on imported goods. This is no longer a tariff dispute at the policy level. It's an everyday economic problem for workers, consumers, and local economies. Carney is determined to protect Canadian businesses. We're willing to sign a security and economic or commercial agreement with the United States that's in Canada's best interest, and only that. Prime Minister Mark Carney has kept his words measured, but his timeline is now fixed. If no trade deal is reached with the U.S. by July 21st, Canada will impose new tariffs on American steel and aluminum. The announcement came less than 3 weeks after the G7 summit in Alberta, where Trump signed a separate deal with the U.K., but left negotiations with Canada unresolved. Carney has said Canada is open to a bilateral agreement, but only one that aligns with its national interests. His strategy is pressure without escalation. Let the economic damage speak louder than political rhetoric. Canada didn't shout, it didn't launch a campaign, it just stepped back. The drop in tourists, the collapse in wine exports, and rising consumer costs. These are the quiet consequences of a trade war that's no longer theoretical. And while Trump's tariffs continue to stir debate in Washington, the real impact is being felt in store aisles, gas bills, and unsold crates of California wine. This isn't just about policy anymore, it's about pain and who's willing to end it first. As Canada's ties with the United States fray, Prime Minister Mark Carney moves to strengthen ties with Europe. Carney has signed a strategic defense and security partnership with the European Union, an agreement that comes as Canada rewrites its relationship with the United States and works towards a new trade deal. This summer, something unusual happened at the NATO summit. While President Trump pushed allies to ramp up defense spending and double down on tariffs, Canada did something else entirely. It signed a sweeping deal not with the United States, but with the European Union. For Washington, it felt like a challenge. But for Ottawa, it was a calculated pivot. One that told the world, if America won't lead, we will find new partners who will. And at the center of this shift, a quiet but bold confrontation between two men, President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Mark Carney. Carney and Trump have committed to reaching a trade deal by the middle of July. You know, he likes tariffs. He said it many, many times. So we have to find a way to demonstrate that we can achieve the same goals with the United States, Canada, through other means that don't necessarily involve these punishing tariffs, especially on strategic goods. The tensions didn't come out of nowhere. They had been building for months. Back in early March, Trump's administration imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian steel, along with a 10% tariff on energy exports. Branded as liberation tariffs, the White House claimed they were about fairness and national resilience. But in Canada, the move landed like a punch to the gut. For industrial towns like Hamilton or Sault Ste. Marie, places built on steel mills and energy plants, orders dried up, layoffs spread. Between January and May 2025, Canada's manufacturing sector lost over 59,000 jobs, according to Statistics Canada. For Prime Minister Carney, a former central banker with a deep understanding of supply chains and capital flows, this wasn't just about diplomacy. It was about livelihoods, and he made that clear. If a deal with the U.S. wasn't reached by July 21st, Canada would strike back. Ottawa outlined a clear position: remove the tariffs or face targeted countermeasures. The message was firm but calm. Trade should be fair, open, and reciprocal. But Washington wasn't budging. President Trump, in his typical fashion, signaled little interest in compromise. Tariffs, he said, worked, and negotiations only if Canada came to the table on his terms. We are going to build trading relationships with like-minded partners, reliable partners, partners that are aligned with our values. It begins here. So Carney pivoted fast and deliberately. Days before the NATO summit in The Hague, he landed in Brussels and signed a strategic security and economic partnership with the European Union. The deal covered defense procurement, LNG cooperation, critical minerals, and a commitment to deepen digital trade infrastructure. For Canada, it wasn't just a show of independence. It was a structural move to diversify away from the American orbit. The partnership includes aligning Canada's industrial policy with that of Europe, working on new nuclear energy agreements, and developing rare earth supply chains together. German-built submarines and expanded naval integration were also on the table. At the same time, Canada pledged to meet NATO's 2% spending target and aim for 5% over the next decade, roughly $150 billion per year, according to projections by the Canadian Department of Finance. A large part of that would be invested in domestic resilience projects like mining, port upgrades, and infrastructure to move Canadian minerals across the Atlantic. The goal: reduce dependence on both the US and China, strengthen ties with Europe, and signal to Washington that Canada isn't waiting for permission to modernize. In Brussels, Carney stood shoulder to shoulder with EU leaders, echoing shared values: open trade, defense cooperation, rule of law. The optics were unmistakable. Back in Washington, officials didn't say much, but for those watching closely, the silence said it all. The Canada-EU deal wasn't a spontaneous reaction. It was months in the making, but its timing, just weeks before the US-Canada trade deadline, was no coincidence. As Carney tightened ties with Brussels, Trump doubled down on his tariff campaign. No mention of exemptions, no movement on steel or energy, just more pressure. But for Ottawa, this wasn't about retaliating with rhetoric. It was about reshaping the map. And while Washington may have underestimated Carney's quiet resolve, the next few weeks would test that strategy day by day. Because in 30 days, the clock would run out.